Hi guys! So before we get started with today's video, let's learn colors in Romanian. Let's learn colors. So today I'm going to start with one color, and I was thinking about roșu. 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 Well done guys, you just said red in Romanian. Good job everyone. I don't know why I picked red, because it doesn't seem like it's the start of the colors, but I mean, which one is the start of the colors? Anyway, I promise that on this occasion I'm going to keep a list of the colors that I already said, because I want to make sure that I am going to tell you all the colors, all the names for the colors in Romanian. So for today's video we are talking about a really strange case. But before we get started, just a quick disclaimer: I don't mean any disrespect to anyone I talk about in the video. This is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All the information I'm giving you is already found in the public domain, and I also don't mean any disrespect to anyone I talk about in the video. Thank you so much. Of course, I will also be giving my opinions and my views around the video. It all started with a Facebook post, and from there the discovery of over 100 people diagnosed with brain cancer. And what do all these people have in common? They went to the same high school. What are the odds that over 100 people who attend the same school all get brain cancer? And how was the connection even made? Let's find out. Let's dig deeper and find out. The victims, who all went to Colonia High School in Woodbridge, New Jersey, developed the rare glioblastoma years after studying or working in that high school. The link was spotted only when one former student, who is now an environmental scientist, realized that people he knew from the school were getting sick. Al Lupiano had a brain tumor around 20 years ago, but then his wife also had one. And then his sister had one as well, who sadly passed away in February 2022, so just a few months ago, aged just 44. Now, you can argue that, maybe genetics had a role in this, but that doesn't really explain how Al's wife had a tumor as well after discovering his tumor. 50-year-old Al says that the diseases could be traced back to a nearby sampling plant that dealt with uranium for the first atomic bomb under the Manhattan Project. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of this project before, and honestly, I don't even know if I can talk about this project on YouTube, but I'm just gonna take my chances here, because I think it's really important to mention what the Manhattan Project was all about. So this project was a research and development program during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. It was led by the United States with the support of the United Kingdom and Canada. From 1942 to 1946, the project was under the direction of Major General Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos lab that designed the actual bombs. The Army component of the project was designated the Manhattan District, as its first headquarters were in Manhattan. The project began quite small in 1939, but grew to employ more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion, the equivalent to about $23 billion in 2020. Over 90% of the cost was for building factories and to produce fissile material, which is basically material capable of sustaining a nuclear chain reaction. Less than 10% of the money was for development and production of the weapons. Research and production took place at more than 30 sites across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Two types of atomic bombs were developed at the same time during the war: a relatively simple gun-type fission weapon and a more complex implosion-type nuclear weapon. The Thin Man gun-type design proved impractical to use with plutonium, and therefore a simpler gun type called Little Boy was developed that used uranium-235, an isotope that makes up only 0.7% of natural uranium. Since it was chemically identical to the most common isotope uranium-238 and had almost the same mass, separating the two proved quite difficult. And for this, three methods were employed for uranium enrichment: electromagnetic, in gas form, and thermal. Most of this work was performed at the Clinton Engineer Works at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In parallel with the work on uranium was an effort to produce plutonium, which was discovered by researchers at the University of California, Berkeley in 1940s. After the viability of the world's first artificial nuclear reactor, the Chicago Pile 1, was demonstrated in 1942 at the Metallurgical Lab in the University of Chicago. The project designed the X-10 graphite reactor at Oak Ridge and the production reactors at the Hanford site in Washington state, in which uranium was irradiated and transmuted into plutonium. The plutonium was then chemically separated from the uranium using the bismuth phosphate process. The Fat Man plutonium implosion type weapon was developed in a joint design and development effort by the Los Alamos lab. The project was also charged with gathering intelligence on the German nuclear weapon project. Through Operation Alsos, Manhattan Project staff served in Europe, sometimes behind enemy lines, where they gathered nuclear materials and documents and rounded up German scientists. Despite the Manhattan Project's tight security, Soviet atomic spies successfully penetrated the program. The first nuclear device ever detonated was an implosion-type bomb at the Trinity test conducted at New Mexico's Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range on 16th of July 1945. Little Boy and Fat Man bombs were used a month later in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively, with Manhattan Project staff serving as bomb assembly technicians and as weaponeers on the attack aircraft. I'm sure that everybody by now has heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the immediate post-war years, the Manhattan Project conducted weapon testing at Bikini Atoll as part of Operation Crossroads, developed new weapons, promoted the development of the network of national labs, supported medical research into radiology, and laid the foundations for the nuclear navy. It maintained control over American atomic weapons research and production until the formation of the United States Atomic Energy Commission in January 1947. Okay, so now that we got a bit into what the Manhattan Project was all about, now this makes a lot of sense, right? Radiation and radiation contamination, right? We all know that radiation causes cancer. Colonia High School in New Jersey is just around 12 miles away from Middlesex sampling plant, where, as part of the Manhattan Project, there was a secret lab which processed and stored domestic and foreign ores containing uranium, thorium, and beryllium. From 1950 to 1955, United Lead Corporation, a subsidiary of National Lead Company, was the AEC's operating contractor for the Middlesex sampling plant. The Middlesex sampling plant sampled, analyzed, stored, and shipped uranium, thorium, and beryllium ores. The plant discontinued uranium and beryllium analyzing and sampling activities in 1955. And until 1967, the site was used as a thorium storage and sampling site. Now going back to Al, when Al's sister was on her deathbed, he promised that he will uncover the cause of the illness, and he said that he won't rest until he has answers. Al Lupiano was diagnosed with a tumor in 2002, and at the time he didn't really make any connection to the school until his own wife and sister were taken ill. His sister, Angela De Silis, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, although I don't think I am, passed away in March, and this encouraged him into researching the cause. He started with a small sample of patients, but as the numbers grew, he noticed that people either worked or studied at the same high school. Realizing this, Lupiano posted about his research on Facebook, and he soon discovered the number of people affected skyrocketed. He told CBS News, quote, "I started doing some research, and the 3 became 5, the 5 became 7, the 7 became 15. Fast forward to August of last year. My sister received the news she had a primary brain tumor herself. Unfortunately, it turned out to be stage 4 glioblastoma. 2 hours later, we received information that my wife also had a primary brain tumor." End of quote. What are the odds in the space of 2 hours? Your sister is diagnosed and then your wife is also diagnosed. Something is just not right, is it? Earlier this year, Elle was flooded with former classmates and teachers from the school saying that they were also dealing with rare brain tumors. The vast majority graduated between 1975 and 2000, but there is one case as recently as 2014. Lupiano continued, quote, "What I find alarming is there is truly only one environmental link to primary brain tumors, and that's ionizing radiation. Is not contaminated water, is not air, is not something in soil, is not something done to us due to bad habits." End of quote. Stacy Ramos was one of those to contact him, telling him how she was just 41 years old when she got sick. She said, quote, "At the age of 41, I found out I had a very rare soft tissue malignant tumor, spindle cell carcinoma, which engulfed my tear duct where they believe it began. My orbit, sinus, I lost half of sinus canal, nasal cavity, and it began growing in or towards my ear tubes and was getting close to my brain. I had symptoms for 3+ years prior, but was undetected until it got worse. I'm currently having issues with the right ear and tube on the cancer side I'm worried about." End of quote. So now Elle, having mentioned ionizing radiation, let's just look a bit into what ionizing radiation is. Me personally, I would honestly prefer not to go into the chemical and all these scientific things, because honestly, I completely, utterly hate chemistry and I was rubbish in school at it. However, I find it quite fascinating that once you go into research how you can envision and connect dots which you wouldn't otherwise. So, radiation, according to the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, exists all around us. And radiation is found in 2 forms, ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Non-ionizing radiation is a form of radiation with less energy than ionizing radiation. Unlike ionizing radiation, non-ionizing radiation does not remove electrons from atoms or molecules of materials that include air, water, and living tissue. So if we go back to the Manhattan Project, simply they were trying to take uranium and other materials which didn't have quite enough strength to be nuclear, and they separated them and kind of changed them to make them strong enough to be used as nuclear weapons, or part of the weapon, should I say, the deadliest part, right? So even simpler, because you know that's the way I myself understand things. Take for example, you have flour. You use flour in baking, right? But then flour on its own doesn't quite get the dough to rise. So you then have to add yeast and mostly warm milk. This then induces a chemical reaction and releases. And that's how you get the dough to rise. The base is still flour, right? But you help it by adding something else to it. And I never believed in my life that I would compare nuclear bombs and chemical reactions to flour and dough, but here we are. Yeah. So now, non-ionizing radiation has less energy than ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, on the other hand, is a form of energy that acts by removing electrons from atoms and molecules of materials that include air, water, and living tissue. Ionizing radiation can travel unseen and pass through all these materials I just mentioned. It's on the right side of the electromagnetic spectrum in this figure, which is on your screen. A very common example of ionizing radiation is that of X-rays, and I think everybody knows what X-rays are, which can penetrate our body and they can reveal pictures of our bones. We say that X-rays are ionizing, meaning that they have the unique capability to remove electrons from atoms and molecules in the matter through which they pass. Ionizing activity can alter molecules within the cells of our body. That action may cause eventual harm such as cancer. Intense exposures to ionizing radiation may produce skin or tissue damage. Ionizing radiation can penetrate the human body and the radiation energy can be absorbed in tissue. This has the potential to cause harmful effects to people, especially at high levels of exposure. Natural sources of ionizing radiation usually release ionizing radiation at low levels, which also means that the amount of radiation absorbed by our bodies, or the doses if you will, is usually small. Natural sources of ionizing radiation include radioactive elements that are naturally in our body. For example, a small fraction of the potassium in our bodies is radioactive. Radon, however, is a natural radioactive gas found in rock formations that can release higher levels of radiation that can pose health risks. Now, keep in mind this name radon. Radon, I don't even know if I'm saying it right, because this radon thing will be very, very important later on in the video. This type of radiation with radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the United States. The levels of radon in your home or building depend on a variety of factors. You can test your home or building to determine whether you or your family is at risk of high levels of radon exposure. Medical diagnostic exams are the main man-made source of ionizing radiation exposure in the US, and I suppose not only the US. The goal of medical diagnostic imaging is for the benefits to far outweigh the risks. Magnetic resonance imaging, also known as MRIs, and ultrasound technology are examples of diagnostic exams that do not involve exposure to ionizing radiation. So that's why, for example, when you have an X-ray done, it's advised not to have more than one in a year. In the UK, for example, if I'm right, either one a year or one every 2 years. I'm not quite sure exactly how many a year it's advised for you to have, but when I've been for an X-ray, I remember seeing these leaflets that were stuck on the walls, even in the changing room where I change my clothing before going in for one, and they would kind of give you, warning and advice of how many you should have in a year, how much radiation you should be exposed to. When I started researching for this, I obviously, tried to get as many details as I possibly could. So I came across an environmental report from Middlesex Sampling Plant for the calendar year of 1989. I have to say, this is an environmental report. I didn't understand much of it. It's a 99-page report. However, I do know that they tested the air, the water, the soil, the surrounding area, and I know that there was radon found. And also, as far as I understand from the report, there was uranium found in the water which ran under the facility, groundwater, and also surface water in the vicinity. There was also radium found. In conclusion, the levels found was not above any radiation people would be exposed naturally. More than 100 people who have made contact with Lupiano include several types of primary brain tumors, such as cancerous forms like glioblastoma. But they also include non-cancerous, yet debilitating masses such as acoustic neuromas, hemangioblastomas, and meningiomas. Glioblastoma or glioblastoma multiforme is an aggressive type of brain cancer. It develops when cells supporting nerves in the brain begin to divide uncontrollably. These fast-growing cells invade nearby brain tissue, making them hard to remove, but generally they don't spread to other areas of the body. Survival rates are poor, with less than half of patients surviving more than a year after being diagnosed. About 1 in 30,000 people have the condition, according to estimates. Lupiano launched an investigation to uncover what was happening, with him digging into the school's history, including what was on the site before. But he said, quote, "It was virgin land, it was woods, the high school was the first thing to be there, so there was probably nothing in the ground at that time," end of quote. He told NJ Spotlight News that the high school was 12 miles from Middlesex sampling plant, which was used to crush, dry, and store uranium ore for atomic. According to him, some of the contaminated soil was removed from the site after it shut down in 1967, the same year that Colonia High School was built. He suggested that some of it may have somehow ended up on the school grounds. So we have the Middlesex sampling plant with thorium and uranium, and documentation indicates that operations began at this facility in 1943 and ended in 1955, at which time the facility was used for storage of radioactive materials through 1967. Work included receiving, storing, crushing, grinding, and sampling of ores received from African metals and other sources. In 1969, the property was transferred to the Department of the Navy and used as a Marine Corps training facility. In 1978, the property was transferred back to the DOE for remedial activities. I would be honestly very curious to know if any of the Marine Corps who are training at the facility developed a tumor, because documentation states that prior to the transfer the site was decontaminated. A later survey, however, performed in 1976 identified significant residual contamination that led to decontamination and restoration activities at the facility and surrounding properties. But the Department of Navy used the site as a training facility in 1969 before the contamination was identified. So whoever was there in that training facility, they were exposed to radiation. A survey performed in 1985 indicated that radioactive contamination exceeded unrestricted release criteria. In 1997, the responsibility for site remediation was turned over to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under formerly utilized sites remedial action program, FUSRAP. A FUSRAP fact sheet of December 2007 does not indicate that the cleanup is complete. In a 2011 evaluation, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health concluded that potential exists for significant residual radiation from 1968 to the time of the study. And now guys, we have a second site here, right? Which is the landfill, Middlesex North site. This site was contaminated by thorium and uranium according to government records. The government says it has cleaned up this site under the formerly utilized Sites Action Program, but some additional radioactive contamination was found on the site several years ago, prompting federal officials to consider putting the site back in the program for decontamination. The site served as a disposal site for low-level radioactive pitchblende ore generated from activities at the Middlesex sampling plant. From 1948 to 1960, the Middlesex sampling plant conducted thorium and uranium activities and disposed of the waste at the Middlesex Municipal Landfill. Although this site was designated as part of the formerly utilized Site Action Program FUSRAP in 1980, the only years in which remediation work took place were 1984 and 1986. This work was performed under the Bechtel National Incorporated umbrella site remediation contract by local subcontractors. In 1960, discovery of the contamination was made through observance of abnormal background radiation readings during a civil defense drill. Documentation from the government establishes that after interactions between local and federal authorities, 650 cubic yards of surface material was removed on May 18, 1961. Residual subsurface contamination still existed after this action, but awareness of this condition and the documented radiation levels is considered to pose no significant exposure scenario. The certification docket for remedial action performed at the Middlesex Municipal Landfill in 1984 and 1986 confirmed that the actions taken in 1986 were successful. In the 2011 evaluation, however, potential still existed for significant residual radiation from 1961 to 1983 and in 1985. But the high school was built in 1967, way before the remedial action was taken in 1984 and 1986. So Lupiano could be right. Contaminated soil could have very well been used from the plant or the landfill to build the high school. In one very strange instance, a science lesson had to be stopped when a teacher at the same high school, practicing with a Geiger counter, started picking up huge readings for radiation on a rock. As the class watched, the slate-colored pebble lit up the monitor and puzzled the tutor in the May 1997 class. The school was evacuated minutes later and the team in hazmat suits arrived to test the object. The rock was said to have been taken away by a chemist for testing and was allegedly later found not to be dangerous. Despite this, local officials voiced their concerns at Lupiano's findings, with the mayor pledging to look at possible links between the diseases and the high school.
Al Lupiano, an environmental scientist and former resident of Woodbridge Township, says he has confirmed 65 cases of people with rare brain tumors. The common denominator, they were all Colonia High School graduates or had worked there. Lupiano was diagnosed 20 years ago and still suffers lingering issues. He started researching a connection when other family members were diagnosed with the same extremely rare tumor on the left side of the brain.
Fast forward to August of last year, my sister received the news that she had a primary brain tumor herself. It unfortunately turned out to be stage 4 glioblastoma. 2 hours later, we received information that my wife also had a primary brain tumor.
After his sister sadly passed away less than a month ago, he posted on Facebook calling on all Colonia High School alumni, asking if others had brain tumors, and the response was shocking.
There's truly only one environmental link to primary brain tumors, and that's ionizing radiation. It's not contaminated water, it's not air, it's not something in the soil, it's not something that's done to us due to bad habits.
The school was built in 1967. Lupiano is working with local officials.
It was virgin land, it was woods. High school is the first thing to be there, so there was probably nothing in the ground at that time. The only thing that could have happened potentially is fill brought in during the construction, but we have no records 55 years ago.
The mayor has reached out to the state health department, Department of Environmental Protection, and the Federal Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry.
We're looking at possible things that we can do between the town and the school, and they said they will look at anything we come up with.
The superintendent of schools says he is waiting to hear what the next steps should be from the environmental agencies.
I'm a lifelong resident here. I raised my family here, so the health and safety of our students is of paramount importance to me.
The superintendent superintendent says he plans to send out a note to the school community about where things stand regarding the unofficial research. In the Colonia section of Woodbridge Township, Meg Baker, CBS 2 News.
Now, officials warn that this is still in the early stages and official research has not been conducted, but there may be a reason to dig deeper.
Dr. Sumul Raval said, quote, "To find something like this is a significant discovery. Normally speaking, you don't get radiation in a high school unless something is going on in that area that we don't know." End of quote. District Superintendent Dr. Joseph Massimo said, quote, "I'm a lifelong resident here. I raised my family here, so the health and safety of our students is of paramount importance to me." End of quote. TikTok star Dr. Joe Whittington posted a video about the cases on his social media pages which went viral. He said, quote, "Nobody knows why these tumors are occurring at such a high rate in this population, and researchers are just now trying to figure it out." Logically, you would think some sort of radiation exposure. The trouble is, the school is built on some woodland. It's surrounded by residential areas, and the mayor says that they really don't have records going back further than 55 years to see what the land was used for previously. End of quote. The state's Department of Health, Department of Environmental Protection, and the Federal Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry are also investigating. Brain cancer is actually rare, being detected in about 1 in 15,000 Americans every year according to official figures. But Al Lupiano became suspicious after he, his wife, and his sister were diagnosed with this. Brain cancer types detected in the high school include glioblastoma detected in Mr. Lupiano's sister, which is the most deadly form of brain cancer, where fewer than half of patients survive beyond a year of being diagnosed. President Joe Biden's son, Beau, died from this cancer in 1998. Cases of acoustic neuromas were also found, which is a benign and slow-growing tumor which the vast majority of patients survive. Being exposed to high levels of radiation and having a weakened immune system are key risk factors for brain cancers, according to experts. Mr. Lupiano said, quote, "Doctors said they had never seen my cancer before. It was super rare, or only people that were exposed to nuclear radiation as a child living next to a nuclear power plant that was contaminating their water have this." End of quote. Now let's have a look more in depth into the brain cancers detected at the school. Glioblastoma, or glioblastoma multiforme, like I kept mentioning previously in the video, this one is the deadliest type of brain cancer. It develops when cells supporting nerves in the brain begin to divide uncontrollably. The fast-growing cells also invade nearby brain tissue, making them hard to remove, but they generally don't spread to other areas of the body. Survival rates are poor, with less than half of patients surviving more than 1 year after diagnosis. Like I said previously, about 1 in 30,000 people have the condition according to estimates. Mr. Lupiano's sister was diagnosed with this cancer at the age of 44, passing away shortly afterwards. The National Foundation for Cancer Research, which funds research into cancers, says that glioblastomas are the most lethal form of brain cancer. Warning signs vary depending on where exactly the cancer is in the brain. They include persistent headaches, double or blurred vision, vomiting, loss of appetite, changes in mood and personality, seizures, gradual onset of speech problems. Brain scans are usually used to detect the cancer. Glioblastoma is a stage 4 type of brain cancer, meaning that it is fast growing. Surgery is the main treatment for this brain cancer. Specialist doctors remove as much of the cancer as possible during the surgery. They may suggest that patients stay awake during the procedure. Radiotherapy using high energy X-rays to destroy the cancerous cells may also be used. After surgery, some patients are offered chemotherapy for several months. About 40% of patients survive beyond a year after being diagnosed, according to the American Association of Neurological Surgeons. Only 17% of patients survive more than 2 years after diagnosis. It can lead to death within 6 months if left untreated. This type of cancer is most commonly diagnosed in men around 64 years old, although it can occur in people of all genders and age groups. Prior therapeutic radiation and an impaired immune response are also risk factors for the condition. However, as we now know, Al's sister was only 44 years old when she sadly lost her life to this type of cancer. Acoustic neuromas. This is a slow growing tumor in the brain that doesn't appear to spread to any other areas of the body. It starts on the nerve responsible for hearing and balance. These are rare, responsible for about 8% of all brain tumor diagnoses. Most patients initially have their tumor monitored to ensure that it doesn't grow. If this happens, they will then be offered surgery to remove all or part of it, and the vast majority of patients survive the condition, with only 1 in 200 cases that went to surgery being fatal. Mr. Lupiano was diagnosed with this cancer in 2002 at the age of 27, while his wife Michelle was also found to have the condition. Stacy, who contacted Lupiano, also has this type of cancer. Again, I'm saying, and I'm gonna keep repeating myself here, what are the odds that these rare types of cancer happen to them? Not only Lupiano, but his sister, who had the most severe type of cancer, then him and his wife both have the neuromas, and Stacy, who contacted Lupiano. It's just impossible, guys, in my opinion, for this to just be a coincidence. And let's see, what are the symptoms for these neuromas? The tumor for the acoustic neuromas may initially trigger no obvious symptoms, but as it develops, it can lead to the following warning signs. Hearing loss, usually only in one ear, hearing sounds that come from inside of the body, sensation of moving or spinning, and when the tumor gets larger, it can cause these additional symptoms: persistent headaches, temporary blurred or double vision, numbness, pain or weakness on one side of the face, problems with limb coordination on one side of the body, a hoarse voice or difficulty swallowing. Acoustic neuromas are diagnosed using brain scans, but doctors may also use hearing tests to help estimate the size of the tumor and what treatment may be needed. Whether someone is offered surgery really depends on the size of their acoustic neuroma. Patients with very small growths, up to 2 millimeters or 0.07 inches in diameter, are normally only offered a brain scan every 12 months to keep an eye on the tumor. But if these progress to medium and large tumors beyond 30 millimeters, 1.1 inch, to grow, they will be offered surgery to remove it and avoid it damaging the brain. Radiotherapy may also be offered to kill off the tumor. Most people who are diagnosed with acoustic neuromas survive the condition. Cancer Research UK says that patients generally have a good outcome. This cancer is most commonly recorded in adults around 50 years old, with some estimates suggesting it's twice as common among women. Exposure to radiation and having a weakened immune system are both considered to be risk factors for the condition. Now, the reason why I decided to go into more depth into this is because of the age factors, and you'll understand better a bit later on. And now I'm asking again, what do all these have in common? Exposure to radiation. What do we have in Middlesex? a plant involved in the Manhattan Project dealing with nuclear weapon components, storing uranium, a dump site for material from the plant, and also we have a high school approximately 13 miles away, which was built around the same time that the plant was handed over to be cleaned. Do you think that the government's investigation into the high school found something? I'll give you 5 seconds to answer, and please do give me your answer in the comment section down below.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Just as I believed and just as I thought, the investigation into how more than 100 students who went to the same New Jersey high school developed rare brain cancer found no relationship between those illnesses, according to officials. And why are we even surprised? Al Lupiano was diagnosed when he was 27 years old in the late 90s, and in 2021 both his sister and wife were diagnosed with brain cancer. All three of them went to Colonia High School in Woodbridge, New Jersey. Acoustic neuromas are most commonly in 50-year-old adults. 50 glioblastoma is most commonly diagnosed in 64-year-old adults, unless, of course, you are exposed to radiation. Let that sink in for a few seconds there.
Hello, I'm Dr. Ziad Kazi, a medical toxicologist working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Scientists have been studying the effects of radiation on the body for over 100 years, so we know quite a bit about how radiation interacts with living tissue. Let's take a closer look at how the amount of radiation our bodies receive, otherwise known as the dose, can affect the cells in our bodies.
Once a cell is damaged by ionizing radiation, 3 things can happen. One possibility is that the cell can repair itself. The cell would then go back to normal. Another possibility is that the damage is not repaired or is misrepaired, so the cell is altered. This alteration may eventually lead to cancer. The third possibility is that there is too much damage to the cell and the cell dies. Cell death is not always a bad option. In addition to dose, the health effects of radiation also depend on the dose rate, or how fast the dose is received. If a person receives a dose over an extended period of time, the health impact won't be as severe as if the dose were received all at once. If the dose is delivered to a portion of the body, the health impact won't be as severe as if the dose were delivered to the whole body. Individual sensitivity to radiation is also a factor. Children and young adults are more likely to develop the late effects of radiation. Young age increases risk for 2 reasons. Younger people have more cells that are dividing rapidly and tissues that are growing. And they have a longer lifespan ahead of them, giving cancers time to develop.
Remember, radiation can affect the body in a number of ways, and the effects of exposure may not be known for many years. For low doses of radiation, there may be no health effects at all. If the dose of radiation is high, medical professionals may perform tests or conduct regular screening to detect and treat health effects.
Woodbridge Township Mayor John McCormack said an independent investigation found no contamination at the school. Quote, "We are very happy to announce that our extensive testing for both radon and radiation in the interior and exterior of the school building produced no evidence of any cancer-causing hazards that warrant further investigation," he said at a press conference last week. And I'm going to quote again here. "This is terrific news for the current students of Colonial High School and their parents who are worried about their safety, along with current staff members. And it is also great news for all former students who attended and staff that worked at Colonia High School since it opened back in 1968. Yes. So, like I suspected, and I guess like what everybody suspected, they found no nothing in the investigation, because I guess that's more important, right? To find nothing, in my opinion, allegedly. T&M Associates, an environmental engineering firm, was asked to investigate a link between the school and brain cancer. Kate McGreevy, an epidemiologist from the New Jersey Department of Health, said that the school's brain cancer rates are, wait for it, are consistent with brain cancer rates in the state and the nation. Quote, the rates are actually consistent in New Jersey with the United States. This approach of calculating the expected number was done to provide context to the community. End of quote. So this is what the officials are saying, right? Now, according to my own research, brain cancer rates are not consistent with statewide and nationwide rates, like the epidemiologist said. They are not consistent, and I'm not a professional by no means, but the thing is here, guys, I think I need to buy a fish. The thing is that when it smells fishy, it really is fishy, and things are just not adding up. How many times did you hear the government to actually take responsibility for disasters involving war, nuclear weapons, and health issues caused by radiation? Almost never, right? Unless they are forced with evidence from outside of their own investigations. In another word, caught red-handed. Otherwise, they never admit to anything. The government will never ever admit to anything. And now, here is what I think really happened. Let's look at the timeline here. Middlesex sampling plant had a secret lab in World War II, part of the Manhattan Project. In 1960, contamination at the landfill was discovered. This is after the plant is not used anymore for the project, after the cleanup was done, Colonia High School is built in 1967 on Virgin lands. However, it's not known what was there before the high school was built, as according to officials, they don't have any records from 55 years ago, right? Soil is removed from this sampling plant, and soil is then used in construction around the same time that the high school is built. The vast majority of students affected by cancer graduated between 1975 and 2000. In the 90s, a radioactive rock is found inside the high school during science class. In 2011, there is an evaluation of the sampling plant. This found that potential still exists for significant residual radiation. In 2011, there is an evaluation at the disposal site, the landfill. This found that potential still exists for significant residual radiation. Now, how much do you want to bet that Al Lupiano and the students are not the only ones affected by this cancer? And how much do you want to bet that officials know about it? And how much do you want to bet that there is still radiation there? Dangerous levels of radiation. There is a reason why people living in the vicinity of nuclear plants develop cancer, because of radiation. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, radioactive contamination and radiation exposure could happen if radioactive materials are released into the environment as the result of an accident, an event in nature, or an act of terrorism. Such a release could expose people and contaminate their surroundings and personal property. Radioactive contamination happens when radioactive material is deposited on or in an object or a person. Radioactive materials released into the environment can cause air, water, surfaces, soil, plants, buildings, people, or animals to become contaminated. A contaminated person has radioactive materials on or inside their body. External contamination occurs when radioactive material in the form of dust, powder, or liquid comes into contact with a person's skin, hair, or clothing. In other words, the contact is external to a person's body. People who are externally contaminated can then become internally contaminated if radioactive material gets into their bodies. So I'm guessing that you can say if your skin absorbs it, then obviously gets into your body. I guess. Logic, I think. Internal contamination occurs when people swallow or breathe in radioactive materials, or when radioactive materials enter the body through an open wound or are absorbed through the skin. Some types of radioactive materials stay in the body and are deposited in different body organs. Other types are eliminated from the body in blood, sweat, urine, and feces. Radiation exposure happens when radioactive materials give off a form of energy that travels in waves or particles. This energy is called radiation. When a person is exposed to radiation, the energy penetrates the body. For example, when a person has an X-ray, he or she is exposed to radiation. A person exposed to radiation is not necessarily contaminated with radioactive material. A person who has been exposed to radiation has had radioactive waves or particles penetrate the body, like, when you have an X-ray. For a person to be contaminated, radioactive material must be on or inside of his or her body. A contaminated person is exposed to radiation released by the radioactive material on or inside the body. An uncontaminated person can be exposed by being too close to radioactive material, or even a contaminated person, place, or thing. To get exposure or contamination, radioactive materials could be released into the environment in the following ways: a nuclear power plant accident, an atomic explosion, an accidental release from a medical or industrial device, nuclear weapons testing. People who are externally contaminated with radioactive material can contaminate other people or surfaces that they touch. For example, people who have radioactive dust on their clothing may spread the radioactive dust when they sit in chairs or even when they hug other people. People who are internally contaminated can expose people near them to radiation from the radioactive material inside their bodies. The body fluids, blood, sweat, urine of an internally contaminated person can contain radioactive materials. Coming in contact with these body fluids can result in contamination and or exposure, even a simple thing as kissing your partner. People who are externally contaminated can spread the contamination by touching surfaces, sitting in a chair, or even walking through a house. Contaminants can easily fall from clothing and contaminate other surfaces. Homes can also become contaminated with radioactive materials in body fluids from internally contaminated people. Making sure that others don't come in contact with body fluids from a contaminated person will help prevent contamination of other people in the household. But then if you don't know you are contaminated, you can't really help prevent other people in your household to become contaminated as well. Since radiation cannot be seen, smelled, felt, or tasted, people at the site of an incident will not know whether radioactive materials were involved. So now we know how radiation can be spread. It's enough for only one person to have it. They touch something or someone and then it spreads. You become contaminated as well. And then you've got all these students at high school who are seeing and touching each other every day, using the same tables, the same desks, the same stationery and this kind of thing. So you can see how easily it can spread. Lupiano said, quote, I don't think this is the end of the story. I have a really bad feeling we are going to find contamination beyond the high school. There is lots and lots of people calling me saying, look, I don't go to the high school, but I live a mile away, and we call our block Cancer Alley. End of quote. The 110 people that Lupiano has counted on his list of former Colonia high school graduates have been diagnosed with cancerous or non-cancerous primary brain tumors, meaning they originated in the brain. Secondary brain tumors, which originate elsewhere in the body and then spread to the brain, are more common. Lupiano, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is an environmental scientist who tested ground samples for toxins over the course of his 33-year career. He suggested that the school's grounds could be contaminated, pointing to Middlesex, New Jersey sampling plant as a potential linking factor behind the 100+ tumors. The plant, which has since closed, is about a 30-minute drive from Colonia High School. It was an entry point for uranium ores that were imported for use in the nation's early atomic energy program, were assayed at the Middlesex sampling plant and then shipped to other sites for processing, according to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, New York Division. So now you potentially can have even a situation like, for example, let's say that people working at the plant, at the processing plant, use a car, they get into their car to go and pick up their kids from school, right? This person working at the plant is already contaminated, so they contaminate the car seats in the car as well, and then they go to pick up the kid from school. The kid sits in the car, then the kid gets contaminated through the clothing because he's sitting in the car seat. Then they both get home. They are already both of them contaminated. At home, they get out of the car, they go in the house, they touch everything and everybody in the household, and they contaminate the whole household. So this is like a how do you say, a link chain reaction or a chain link reaction. Yeah, so this is like, yes, it's like a reaction. Yeah, a chain link reaction, yes. From one you have two, from two you have three, and so on and so forth. And the more people you get into contact with, the more people you contaminate potentially. And this spreads and spreads and spreads, and so on and so on. The Middlesex plant received uranium, thorium and beryllium ores between 1940s and 1967, which is the same year that Colonia High School was built. The plant then decontaminated to the standards in effect at the time. Though overlooked during the contamination were traces of radioactive materials that had been carried off-site over the years by wind and rain to yards of neighboring homes. People who have been exposed to ionizing radiation have an increased risk of developing primary brain tumors, whether they are malignant or benign, according to the Mayo Clinic. Quote, "We have really solid data on primary brain tumors because of what we learned after World War II. What we learned after Chernobyl," Lupiano explained. "The medical journals are rich with data supporting ionizing radiation causes brain tumors. So that's why I focused on cancerous or malignant and benign, because they are triggered by the same thing. And we have really solid statistics to say all." End of quote. Lupiano says that he has witnessed in his career, quote, "what happens when our government and our military are involved with leaving a location and not being very good environmental stewards. They tend to leave stuff behind, and that stuff tends to migrate from one location to another. So it's not unheard of. That contaminated field would have been spread all over this town from a point source that I've yet to identify, that was illegally dumped back in the 40s, 50s and 60s, he said. So if that's the case, that could explain why we have pockets of these rare cancers all over Woodbridge Township." End of quote. Even though we know that radiation travels through air, water, soil, objects, people, officials who did the investigation into the high school They only tested the soil itself. We also know that long exposure to radiation causes cancer. So between the contaminated soil, then transportation to the landfill, the building of the high school, all the students attending the high school, and Al Lupiano developing cancer at the age of 27, everything fits and goes right back to radiation, exposure, and contamination. What needs to happen, in my honest view and opinion, is the soil needs to be tested, the water needs to be tested, the air needs to be tested, tests need to be performed around Middlesex and Woodbridge as well. This is far bigger than the officials make it seem. An animal could have carried radiation from a forest to the forest where the high school was built. Maybe there are streams, ravines, rivers running from Middlesex to where the high school was built. Yes, this is just like Porton Down in the UK and the experiments with anthrax that they did on Greenard Island. A dog touched a sheep carcass after it was washed to shore and the dog died because the sheep was still contaminated. The land at Greenard Island is not usable to this day. I know that anthrax is not, nuclear weapon material, but then look at Chernobyl, for example. We all know what happened at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Chernobyl. This is no playing matter, and in Chernobyl, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for tens of years, nothing could be grown on the contaminated site. Nobody could live in that area because of contamination, and so many other huge, enormous problems. The government will do what they need to do to cover their asses. In my opinion, they don't care about the people who are affected. And I'm really curious to know what water source the high school is using. The neighbors in the vicinity, do they have cancer? Are they using the same water source? I'm curious to know how many cases of cancer does the town and Middlesex have, and how many of those can be attributed to radiation. Middlesex area needs to be looked at, the lands, the woods, the water, the surrounding areas. Woodbridge needs to be looked at, all types of cancer rates. I will tell you one thing, in New Jersey, cancer rates are higher than the national average. Looking at these statistics, between 2014 and 2018 cases per 100,000 population per year, New Jersey rate is 486.7, whereas the USA rate is 448.6. Looking at the following chart, you can see cases from 2000 with a slow decline over the years. We also know that radiation will eventually dissipate, but it takes time. Very little radioactivity from weapons testing, for example, in the 50s and 60s, can still be detected in the environment now, but we are talking about the 50s or 60s. However, the high school was built in 1967. The students graduated between 1975 and 2000. That was early days in being exposed to radiation, and I believe contamination as well. Radiation can cause cancer in most parts of the body, in all animals and at any age. Although radiation-induced tumors usually take 10 to 15 years and can take up to 40 years to become clinically manifest. It all, guys, seriously, it all fits with the timeline. Al was diagnosed when he was 27. He went to high school more than 10 years prior to being diagnosed. If he was contaminated, that explains how his wife and his sister also got the cancer, possibly through radiation contamination. But like I said, I'm afraid that we will never know the true level of radiation and people affected by it. So, just imagine the government or officials having to say that, yes, a whole town and even more are affected because of radiation. How much public outrage would that bring? And obviously they don't want that. I think that the only way that we will truly know is if someone will be a whistleblower or if someone exposes them. Have you guys heard of this case before? 100+ students all going to the same high school developing brain tumors. It's just beyond belief. But then again, it shouldn't be beyond belief, because we already know that in so many instances this is happening, and the big companies are always covering everything, and the government is usually, in my opinion, allegedly complicit in that, because you know, money speaks volumes, and in most of the cases these private companies and the government agencies and all these companies, they are big and they make a lot of money, and so of course they don't want to, you know, the government doesn't want to lose on the tax and all this kind of rubbish things, which I don't even want to get into. However, there is just one last thing that I'm going to mention here, and I'm just going to give you an example of how it is possible. Teflon and Tefal. Bailey Sarian actually covered that in one of her videos. It's an eye-opener on how far a company is willing to go to cover up the damages that they did. So with Teflon, it poisoned the waters in America, for example, and they worked their asses off to cover everything up. So they were not concerned in the slightest about people being exposed and with serious illnesses following that. So yeah, it just goes to show, when you have big companies, big pharma, the government agencies and the government, and all of them combined, it's kind of like you are fighting an unwinnable war here. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. Please take care, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.